Hi everyone, this is our project on Helminth microbes. The first microbe we're going to talk about are the flatworms and their characteristics. Flatworms are also known as phylum Helminthus. They can vary in size from 1 millimeter to 20 meters, which is 66 feet. They belong to kingdom Animalia. They have a flat body due to their lack of having a body cavity, and they also lack a complete digestive system and a respiratory system. They're also called bilaterally symmetrical because their body can be divided into two. Some more flatworm characteristics. They are able to directly exchange gases with the environment through diffusion. These flatworms are also known to be tripoblastic because they're able to develop organ systems through one of their three embryonic cell layers, which are the ectoderms, mesoderm, and endoderms. The mesoderm layer is the layer that are able to help them develop their organ systems. Some of these organ systems are the muscular organ systems to help allow movement, the excretory system to help with sodium and water balance, and the nervous system. They are also, 85% of flatworms are parasitic, and they live in a marine, freshwater, and moist environment. Some lifestyle and nutrition information on the flatworms. Flatworms are hermaphroditic, which means they have both female and male reproductive organs to be able to produce sexually. They're also able to produce asexually, and an example of this would be a type of flatworm called planarians, which are asexually produced in freshwater and land. The fertilization happens internally, and the synthesization of their eggs will then occur. Their hosts are mainly vertebrate hosts, including humans and some animals. After the flatworm fertilizes in the host, the fertilized eggs will then leave the host's body and hatch as larvae. Once the larvae hatches, it will contaminate the water plants, which will be ingested by either humans or animals, and the life cycle will happen all over again. Here in this next slide is an image of the life cycle, and you can see how it starts and how it finishes and how it is a cycle. In this next slide here, we have, we go into depth of defining what an intermediate host is, and an intermediate host are the organisms that are in their sexually immature forms of the parasitic development, or where the parasite only reproduces asexually. Neuracidium are the free-swimming ciliated larval stage where the flatworm passes from the egg to its first host, or its intermediate host. The host, usually that's in the middle. This host is a mollusk, and it is typically a snail, just like shown in the previous image. A flatworm intermediate host and a definitive host. Once the intermediate host, the flatworm will go through a complex asexual replication process with many stages. Those stages will include sporosis, radiae, and cercariae. Cercariae are a free-swimming larval stage where the flatworm passes from its intermediate host to its final host or definitive host. This host is a vertebrate. These are some examples of these microbes under the microscope. So here is the egg, Neuracidium, sporocyst, radiae, and cercaria.
All right, so here we get to the examples of flatworm. The first example is the Trematoda. It is also known as flukes. They are parasitic flatworms that require two hosts to complete their cycle. They get transmitted into the body by traveling from the intestines to the bile ducts in the liver, where they then live and grow. Some symptoms are abdominal pain, sickness, fever, vomiting, diarrhea, hives, malaise, decreased appetite, and weight loss. Here we get to the second example, which is the Cystoda. It is also known as the tapeworms. They are parasitic flatworms that invade the intestinal tracts of animal and humans. They are capable of growing up to 75 feet long, causing infections, allergic reactions, and disease. They get transmitted into our bodies via food, especially when the meat is undercooked or it is raw. Once it is inside the body, the tapeworm head attaches to the inner wall of the intestines and feeds off the food that is being digested. Some symptoms include weakness, loss of appetite, abdominal pain, diarrhea, dizziness, salt cravings, and weight loss. Here we get to the last example of the flatworm, which is the Turbellaria. It consists of the planaria flatworms. They are typically non-parasitic and can be found in freshwater, saltwater, and less often moist soil. They get transmitted into our bodies through the skin or worm eggs. Some symptoms vary in this flatworm depending on which part of the body the worms inhabit, but can include fever, abdominal pain, coughing, diarrhea, and enlargement of the liver and spleen.
Now we're going to talk about roundworms. Some roundworms' characteristics are physical appearance. Roundworms are elongated, round bodies that measure up to 3.3 feet long. The head is hard, shaped as a spear, and is covered with bristles. The body is strong, also flexible, and is covered in grooves. The roundworm has 3 tissue layers, the outer, middle, and inner. There's a layer filled with fluid. It's a false body cavity that is in between the inner and middle layer. Unlike flatworms, a roundworm has internal organs. Roundworms have a digestive system and a nervous system. Roundworms live in water and soil, and they also feed on fungi and bacteria. The digestive system, the roundworm digestive system is different from flatworms. They don't have a stomach, but they do have an intestine that will produce enzymes that will allow the roundworm to break down the food and absorb nutrients. This large intestine that breaks down the food with enzymes is called the gut. The last part of the digestive system is the rectum. This allows the roundworm to get rid of its waste. Lastly, the nervous system. There are 4 nerves that run down the length of the body, as you can see below, connecting from head to tail. At the head, there are circle rings, and this acts as their brain. At the head, there are also a few tiny sensory organs, and this includes the chemoreceptors, and it senses chemicals.
The life cycle of parasitic roundworms can vary between species, but all of them have 3 main lifestyle stages that are the egg, a larvae, which can be broken down into 3 sub-stages, and then the adult. The differences come between what the infectious stage is, the ova versus the larva, but in all of them, the larvae will start to mature in the lungs before moving to the small intestine to finish maturing and to reproduce. For the life cycle of ova infectious stage roundworms, they live in the small intestine, and the ova are shed in the feces where they embryonate in the environment until they are ingested again, usually in contaminated food. The larvae hatch in the small intestine and then travel through the intestinal mucosa and then to the lungs using the hepatic portal vein. Once in the lungs, over the next 2 weeks, the larvae will grow larger until it reaches the L3 stage. At that point, they are coughed up, swallowed, and travel back to the small intestine to mature to adult and repeat the cycle. The entire maturation process takes 2 to 3 months from the point of the egg being ingested to new eggs being laid, and adult roundworms can live 1 to 2 years. And this picture just shows that visually. Then there are some differences of the life cycle of larvae infectious stage roundworms. The adults still live in the intestine, but once the ova are shed, they hatch when in the environment about 1 to 2 days after being shed. And then 5 to 10 days later, the larvae become infectious, but they can be free living in the environment for 3 to 4 weeks. Once in contact with the skin, the L3 larvae will burrow into the host, where they use the blood vessels to travel into the lungs. Then they ascend up to the pharynx and are swallowed. Once in the small intestine, they also repeat the cycle and live 1 to 2 years. And this shows the difference between the previous visual aid. Roundworms can eat a variety of things. Free-living roundworms in the environment feed off of bacteria, algae, insects, and even plants. But intestinal roundworms feed on the host with the intestinal tissues and fluids. They can eat blood, which leads to anemia, and they also eat mucus.
In this slide, we are going to be talking about the roundworm intermediate and definitive hosts. An intermediate host would be one that would aid in the development of the parasite, but it doesn't conduct any of the sexual reproduction, so it would act as a step in the process, but it is not the final step. The final step would basically be the definitive host, which is where the sexual reproduction takes place, because the roundworm would need to be living in the host in order to begin the reproduction. So an intermediate host might include a small animal like a snail, and a definitive host would be more of a human. So roundworms can be formed basically from undercooked or uncooked food or food that is contaminated.
Okay, and there are 6 different types of roundworms. The first one is oscariasis, which is typically found in human feces and is transmitted through poor hygiene, typically by putting one's hands into their mouth. It's possible that no symptoms are present, but when symptoms are present, there may be live worm in the stool, wheezing, coughing, fever, severe abdominal pain, vomiting, restlessness, and disturbed sleep may be experienced. The second type here is more commonly known as hookworm, and it is passed by human feces on the ground that has been stepped in by bare feet. It's possible that people in good health experience no symptoms at all. If abdominal pain is experienced, it's typically barely noticeable, and other possible symptoms include diarrhea, intestinal cramps, colic, and nausea, and those infected will also be severely anemic. The other type here is strongyloidiasis. I can't pronounce it. It's commonly found in tropical and subtropical temperate regions and is contracted through direct contact with contaminated soil. The microbe enters through the skin and travels to the intestines. It can be present with no symptoms to mild symptoms. In those with a moderate infection, they may experience burning in the abdomen, nausea, vomiting, and alternating diarrhea and constipation. In cases where it's severe infection, they may experience anemia, weight loss, and chronic diarrhea. Trichoniasis is a non-intestinal infection, unlike other roundworm infections, and it affects the muscle fibers. It can be transmitted through consumption of undercooked sausage, pork, horse, walrus, or bear meat. And it can be present with little to no symptoms. If symptoms are present as a result of infection in the stomach, they may include diarrhea, abdominal cramping, and tiredness. When the larvae have reached the muscle fibers, those affected may feel muscle aches and pain and experience a high fever, swelling in the eyes and face, and infection in the eyes and rashes. Enterobiasis is more commonly known as pinworm infection and is the most common of all parasitic roundworm infections. It is found in the colon and rectum and develops from pinworm eggs. A female pinworm will deposit her egg in and around the anus, and when it is touched with the fingers, the eggs will enter the person's mouth and travel to the intestine. The eggs are also capable of attaching to bedding, clothing, toys, doorknobs, furniture, and faucets for up to 2 weeks. The pinworm infection will have no symptoms, can have no symptoms, and at all or a very mild symptoms such as itching around the anus or vagina that may become more intense once the eggs have been deposited or laid. And the final one is more commonly known as whipworm, and is the third most common roundworm infection in humans. Whipworm is transmitted by one's hands coming in contact with food that has been in contact with the microbe. It can also be contracted by eating food that has been in contact with it or that was grown in the soil that had been contaminated. It commonly has no symptoms, but in severe cases of infection, some may experience sporadic stomach pain, blood, stool, diarrhea, and weight loss. And then these are our sources. All right, thank you so much.